Just a warning, this next story deals with content that some people might find distressing. A brain-damaged man who died of suspected suicide while in a secure mental health unit shouldn't have been there and was being treated in a way that didn't help his condition, according to a report into his death. 24-year-old Tamaki Heke was found dead in the Waitematā DHB's He Puna Waiora unit last May. His death came just a week after another suspected suicide there. He had previously been diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. He had an intellectual age between 8 and 12 years old and was prone to copycat behaviour as a consequence. The 24-year-old also suffered from PTSD, ADHD and intermittent psychosis and had been admitted to the acute mental health unit 11 times because of suicidal thoughts and self-harm. His final stay was 5 months. On the night of his death, Tamaki Heke's foster parents warned He Puna Waiora he could hurt himself and asked for him to be watched closely because of his copycat behaviour. Here's some of what Waitematā DHB's investigation into the 24-year-old's death found.
He Puna Waiora operated models of care that were unhelpful to meeting Tamaki's needs. A model akin to those used in intellectual disability services would be more effective, with a stable group of carers and an intensive structured support approach. Tamaki was treated symptomatically, and the medication given was not effective in changing his behaviour. A planned education session on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder didn't happen, partly due to the challenge of urging doctors to attend. The criteria to access intellectual disability services is tight, so people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are often unable to access appropriate services. And they only reach the threshold for mental health services in times of crisis, when compulsory treatment is needed to manage acute risk. There was no immediate indication that Tamaki was contemplating suicide, in view of his large meal, happy demeanour and a request to charge his phone shortly before his death. And it's unlikely a particular action could have prevented Tamaki's death, which appears to have been impulsive.
I spoke to Tamaki Heke's foster parents, Rita and Peter Wilcox, a short time ago and started by asking what they thought of the findings.
Quite happy with the findings. Would like to see them a little bit more strongly worded, such that they don't just get put on a shelf. I think there's some important stuff in there that the health system needs to learn from, and the worry would be is that they don't learn from it.
Rita?
Yeah, like Peter, I don't think it's strong enough. There's so many reports that have come out and they agree, and it says that they need to make changes, and then nothing happens. Years later, they're still doing the same thing. And that's my worry with the report, that it's just glossing over that there's blame at Waitematā and they need to do something.
How fit for purpose was the care that your son got at He Puna Waiora? How fit for purpose was it?
Not fit for purpose at all.
No. Basically, it was they were trying to fit him into the wrong model of care. He caused a huge amount of damage to him, we believe.
Yeah, he was put on medication to treat what they thought were conditions when really it was just his disability. So he has brain damage from having fetal alcohol effects, and they were trying to medicate that instead of giving him the emotional support that he needed for day-to-day living. Basically, he needed somebody to guide him through life, and they were using medication to dope him up so that he didn't have to respond to life because he was so doped up.
He was getting behavioural therapies that were not suited to his level of understanding. Is that the case, Peter?
Yes. So basically, if you look at the model that they were trying to put on him, it was beyond his abilities in terms of his disability. And that comes out in the report. And I think that's probably one of the very strong points that needs to be made, is that when things aren't working, then you need to actually stop and go, this isn't working, what do we need to do? Instead, they just kept on trying to repeat the same thing over and over again. It's institutional insanity.
In terms of, so people can understand, the level at which Tamaki understood things, what age would he have been in terms of his understanding?
Probably between the age of 9 and 12, depending on what it was.
So he ended up in He Puna Waiora 11 times, and everybody who contributed to that report agreed that he shouldn't be there. So how can there have been nowhere for someone with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder to go for help? How could that have happened?
Well, the problem with Tamaki is that his IQ was too high. It was
75.
75, and you had to be 73 or 72. There's a criteria that it gets to in the low 70s that you can get
for disability services. Do you mean, Rita?
Yes, from disability services, and he didn't qualify because he was like maybe 5 points too high, but they didn't take into account the assessments don't take into account all the other problems. Like he had a very, very low function ability. That's where he operated at about a 9-year-old. And because the assessment doesn't take those two criteria into account, it only takes the intellectual, he didn't qualify for a thing. He didn't have a physical disability. To them, he didn't have an intellectual disability because he was, a few points too high, and they didn't take his function ability into account because they don't do that in New Zealand.
And recognise it. And the other thing, the only other way that he would have qualified for funding was if he had a psychiatric condition, and he didn't have a psychiatric condition. In all reality, they probably, He Puna Waiora should have treated him the same way they did when they did at 18 at North Shore, when basically he presented there with problems. He kept them in there for 2 weeks, and then they pushed him out the community because basically they said, there's nothing we can do for you, don't qualify for anything. At the same time, at that time, we were asking for support, and they said, well, basically there's nothing. Ultimately, he ended up in prison for a period of while he was on remand. For somebody that's 9 to 12 years old, that I believe is absolutely appalling statement on our society.
So he was in a place where he shouldn't have been, receiving care that wasn't suited to his problems, and being medicated with medication that was doing nothing to help him. So what were the consequences of that?
Basically, over the 3 years, his whole demeanour just cycled down. You'd see him go up and down as he took every knock that was happening in the system because they weren't understanding him. I mean, some of the things that actually occurred to him through the system, if you looked at through his eyes, you would regard as psychological abuse. I mean, the classic case was, and we have a complaint in about this, is that he was in the community, in a place that he was enjoying, he was doing really well, his whole mood was great. They called him in one day to North Shore Hospital to have a sort of routine follow through by the mental health team, and he was told, you're not going back, just like that, without any preparation, nothing. It was just cold blunt, you're not going back. Why? Oh, we haven't got the money.
Yeah, the funding ran out. So we weren't told to support him. His support workers from a separate agency who understood his condition weren't told. So there was nobody to support him. He was just picked up, taken, and never went back. And from that day on, he gave up.
So funding is highlighted as an issue in this report, the lack of continuity around funding and a lack of services. What needs to happen?
What needs to happen is that we need to recognise the role of adaptive function as a disability. Adaptive function looks at an individual's ability to function independently in the community. Tamaki was unable to act and function independently in the community, but we expected him to actually do exactly that. And I think that we have many like Tamaki being dumped in our community, struggling turning up in all sorts of places where they shouldn't, causing problems, and it's purely because the health system fails to recognise adaptive function as a disability.
Do you think other lives are at risk?
Yes.
Yes.
Very much so.
And how worried are you about that?
Well, we're talking to you. I think that's, that's probably to us the highlight of our worry. We're very concerned about what is happening in our mental health system. And there are other people that we talk to that express exactly the same concerns. But the system, like in Tamaki's case, when you talk to them, they ignore what you have to say. They don't listen. They don't want to look it through the patient's eye or through the family's eyes.
And that was Rita and Peter Wilcox. And if that story raises any issues for you and you need to talk, you can call or text 1737 anytime. Waitematā DHB wouldn't be interviewed, but it says it continues to extend its condolences and thoughts to Tamaki Heke's family, whānau and friends. In a statement, it said the report found a number of contextual factors that contributed to recommendations for further action. A priority amongst these is the need for the development of services better able to meet the needs of people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. The DHB fully accepts and agrees with this as an area for attention, locally and nationally, and it has raised the need for care and dedicated services for people with FASD with the Ministry of Health. The DHB says it offered to meet with the Wilcox family to discuss the report, but due to COVID-19 lockdown, this was not possible, but it says the invitation remains open.